The Twin Cities environment and access to parks, determined by vulnerability, cost distance, and neighborhood quality, by Sarah Bruce, a student at the University of St. Thomas. Overview. The ultimate goal that I will come to in this project is to identify target areas in the Twin Cities that are the most vulnerable, have the least access to parks, and the least neighborhood amenities. These target areas will determine where city planners should address and better park accessibility. Physical Inactivity, the Biggest Public Health Problem of the 21st Century, by Stephen Blair, Volume 43, Issue 1, from the British Journal of Sports Medicine. Physical activity is undervalued and underappreciated, but there is an overwhelming amount of evidence to support the importance of regular physical activity on human well-being. For example, physical activity delays cognitive decline, is good for brain health, and reduces the risk of chronic diseases. And the counterpart, low cardiorespiratory fitness accounts for about 16% of all deaths in men and women. As evidence has emerged, there is a need to focus on the importance of regular physical activity for all individuals. This lack of activity has created one of the public health's leading problems and the introduction to the obesity epidemic. The Role of Physical Activity in Pediatric Obesity by Kate Lambourne and Joseph Donnelly from the Pediatric Critical Care Medicine. One factor to the increasing problem of the obesity epidemic is the decreased amount of physical activity in today's youth. As mentioned in previous research, low cardiorespiratory fitness was once just an adult problem, but it is now seen in more and more children. The benefits to physical activity are endless, starting with their crucial role in development. This development process is shaped by a child's learned sensations, perception, and action, all through their external environment. There is also evidence that links physical activity to improvements in academic achievement and cognitive functions. With all these proven benefits, it is highly recommended that children increase their physical activity by increasing playtime outdoors. Children in Nature Deficit Disorder, written by Martha Drisnack, PhD, Volume 14, Issue 1, from the Journal for Specialists in Pediatric Nursing. The recommendation for children to increase their playtime outdoors is not an easy fix in today's society. More and more children are suffering from what is known as nature deficit disorder, a label used to address the increasing cost to children as they are increasingly deprived of direct contact with nature and the experience of unstructured, free play in the out of doors. Children are moved indoors, with all nature-like experiences happening from the window, TV, and through movies. Martha even went far enough to say that children are on house arrest, losing the ability to think and learn about the world directly. But with the average child spending 6.5 hours a day with electronic media, there is no question that kids are losing many primary development skills initiated through nature and have seen an overall increase in obesity. Childhood Development and Access to Nature by Susan Strife and Liam Downey from the U.S. National Library of Medicine, National Institutions of Health. A few studies have asked whether poor and minority youth are less likely than their white and wealthier counterparts to spend time in green spaces and the natural world, and this journal article states that yes, minority youth suffer disproportionately than their counterparts. There are many factors that influence this disproportionality. For example, generally low-income housing is placed in barren and not friendly environments. These environments may be close to environmental hazards and pollution, making going outside less desirable. Again, these neighborhoods are located in places with not many amenities, making access to parks or places to play safely outside nearly impossible. I want to preface that these are variables that I looked at in my research. I wanted to indicate those neighborhoods with the least access to parks and the least neighborhood amenities. These two variables were a great way to indicate those populations that are suffering disproportionately regarding their access to nature. Teens living in disadvantaged neighborhoods lack access to parks and get less physical activity, written by Baby, Hastert, and Brown from the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research. For this study was conducted on California adolescents, the information directly relates to adolescents in the Twin Cities. It is said that adolescents who live in disadvantaged neighborhoods lack access to parks and get less physical activity relative to teens living in more advantaged neighborhoods. This research elaborated on disadvantaged neighborhoods and what they would define them as: low income housing, high rates of crowding, high unemployment, and lower levels of education. A few of these listed variables are what I too looked at when determining what a vulnerable population may be defined as. Park Score Methodology, the Trust for Public Land. The Trust for Public Land has created a methodology to calculate a park score for each park in the United States. This park score is determined on acreage, the facilities available for use, and park access. This allows for a proper evaluation of parks and cities and to help indicate what parks could do better. I would also like to note that Minneapolis and St. Paul are number 1 and 2 in the United States for park scores. Though Minnesota is ranked so high, there are still communities that are suffering and need assistance in building more and better parks. This is a great tool that can be used in the conclusion and solutions of this project. Research question. To identify target areas in the Twin Cities that are the most vulnerable, have the least access to parks, and the least neighborhood amenities. I did this through model building and reclassification of data layers, including vulnerability, that was used at block level data, access to parks, using a tree canopy layer, and neighborhood amenities in the Twin Cities. This is the model I created to identify the most vulnerable populations in the Twin Cities. I did this through 2010 census data, the reclassification tool, and the raster calculator tool. My calculations were as follows: standardized median age plus standardized rent burden plus standardized percent no high school minus standardized percent English speaker minus standardized homeowner percent and minus standardized percent white. The vulnerability model created this map. Those areas with red are the most vulnerable populations, and those areas with blue are the least vulnerable. This is the map that was created from the model. Those areas with easy access to parks are indicated by the blue, green, and yellow colors. Those areas with very little access to parks are indicated by the red colors. This model creates a neighborhood amenities map layer. I did this by reclassifying the tree canopy layer and giving new values depending on what the land is like. For example, for those values that would be beneficial and would add biophilia to a neighborhood, I gave the value of 1. Those values that would not be beneficial to have in a neighborhood were given a value of 0. I then used the focal statistics tool to create a neighborhood cell of 10 meters by 10 meters. With all that said, this created a layer of what each neighborhood holds. Essentially, what can you see from your front porch? This is the model illustrated as a map. The blue color indicates those areas with beneficial neighborhood amenities, and the burnt orange color is those areas with the least amount of beneficial neighborhood amenities. Finally, I created a final model that included all the previous models to find the areas in the Twin Cities that have the least amount of neighborhood amenities, the least access to parks, and are the most vulnerable. This is the final map that was created with the previous model. Those areas that are red are the most vulnerable, have the least access to parks, and have the least amount of neighborhood amenities. I also highlighted the worst of those in blue. The green color symbolizes those areas that are the least vulnerable, have access to parks, and have the most neighborhood amenities. Right at the center of the map with the largest blue cluster is the airport. This makes complete sense given the information that I have mapped. I can also conclude that my model is matching those targeted areas because of the red cluster that is highlighted blue in the South Metro, a waste management facility in Dakota County. But I would like to focus on the areas in Minneapolis, indicated by the star. The areas that are suffering around Minneapolis would be a great place to start addressing the problem of park access. I then zoomed up on the map indicated by the star on the previous slide. This is the specific area that I would like to target. Here would be a great place to add a park. Conclusion. Looking at ArcGIS modeling and processing, I can determine the areas in the Twin Cities that are the most vulnerable, do not have access to parks, and have the least amount of neighborhood amenities. I can determine those areas that need to be targeted and are in need of an increase in the number of parks with better park access. I specifically targeted a neighborhood in Minneapolis located near Target Field. Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board 20-Year Neighborhood Park Plan from the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. Set by the Minneapolis Parks in 2016, the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board and the City of Minneapolis approved ordinances to reserve years of underfunding in neighborhood parks. The 20-year park plan is a long-term initiative that will transform the neighborhood park system. The funding for this project goes to increase maintenance, address rehabilitation projects, and create capital investments. There will be a focus on communities that need it the most. This is determined by communities with concentrated poverty with 50% or more of people of color, population density, youth populations, and crime statistics. With one-year capital investments, Boston Field Park is an area that has received funding from this park plan. This park is located just north of the airport, an area that I have pointed out in being vulnerable, not having access to parks, and not having a quality neighborhood. This park plan will benefit those areas that I have highlighted in my final map and have previously determined to be targeted areas. Better Parks Through Law and Policy, a legal analysis of authorities governing public parks and open space, written by Henderson and Fry from the U.S. National Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health. It is said that improving parks in low-income and minority neighborhoods may be a key way to address physical activity among children that are at greater risk. But it is important for public health advocates to understand the laws and policies behind how public recreation decisions are made. Said by Henderson and Fry, it is important to think strategically about which levels of government to engage, identify park laws, and funding from all levels of government, and also to partner with advocates with similar interests. With these ideas in mind, it may be easier to address the governing of public parks. Access to parks for youth as an environmental justice issue. Access Inequalities and Possible Solutions, written by Riglon and Floor. Addressing this issue of park access can be a hard problem to overcome, but this paper proposes a framework for action to improve access to parks for low-income children and youth. This can help decision makers and planners to prioritize park investments. The graphic on the right is an action framework that would propose an increase in outdoor play opportunities. In brief, the first step is to develop GIS analysis, very similar to the modeling and analysis I have created. The next step would be to outreach to local universities and nonprofits that would provide support and take action. The following steps would be to include local communities, nonprofits, city planners, and developers to implement park plan and code. In final, new parks and outdoor play opportunities for children would be created. This plan is concise with my ultimate goal to create parks for those youth that are suffering disproportionately than their counterparts. This is a plan that can be applied to the Twin Cities here in Minnesota to address this pressing issue.